So today, we're diving into a case
Okay.
I'm sure you've heard of, um, the Junko Furuta case
Mhm.
from 1988. It's one of those stories that sticks with you, but
Okay.
we're going beyond the headlines here. Instead of just the what, we're really going to unpack the why, the societal failures,
Right.
the psychology, the ripples this case still sends out today.
It's not just a tragic story, it's a complex
Right.
intersection of human behavior.
Yeah.
A justice system pushed to its limits and those unsettling societal blind spots we often overlook.
Exactly. So let's start by setting the scene, right? It's 1988, in a seemingly normal suburb in Japan. This is where we meet Junko Furuta, a 17-year-old, with dreams of becoming a singer, good student, works part-time.
Yeah.
Pretty relatable, right?
It's essential to ground ourselves in this normalcy, to
Yeah.
remember that Junko was a person with hopes and aspirations, a life full of promise.
Right.
It drives home the magnitude of what was taken from her.
And it makes the actions of her perpetrators that much harder to comprehend.
Right.
Hiroshi Miyano, 18, Joe Ogura, 17, Shinji Minato, 16, and Yasushi Watanabe, also 17.
Okay.
4 teenagers. But even at the outset, some warning signs hinting at the darkness to come, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Miyano, in particular, had a history of delinquency, gang ties,
Yeah.
and even a disturbing connection to the Yakuza, Japan's organized crime network. So this isn't just teenage mischief. This
Yeah.
is a glimpse into a world where violence and power hold sway.
Okay, so we have our players.
Yeah.
Now, how does it all begin? And it's chillingly calculated, starting with a staged encounter.
Right. Picture this. Junko's riding her bike home when Miyano uses Minato as a pawn to knock her off.
Oh, wow.
And then he swoops in, all charm and concern, offering to walk her home.
Mm-hmm.
This premeditation, the manipulation, speaks to a terrifying level of forethought.
Like something out of a nightmare.
Right.
And it just escalates from there. Over the first 24 hours, they move her from a warehouse to a hotel.
Right.
Each move a step further into this abyss they've created.
What's fascinating here is how each seemingly small transgression emboldened the next. It's a chilling example of how the absence of consequences can fuel further cruelty.
And there's this one detail that gets me every time, the phone calls. Miyano forces Junko to call her parents, reassuring them that she's safe.
Yeah.
It makes my skin crawl just thinking about it.
It's a chilling display, not only of his cruelty, but also his cunning. He knew enough about police procedure to understand that a runaway wouldn't be a top priority.
Wow.
He was actively trying to control the narrative, buy himself more time.
Right, he's playing a terrifying game, and then there's the disturbing inaction of Minato's parents. They knew Junko was being held captive in their own home and did nothing.
Right.
This is where the deep dive gets really unsettling, because it forces us to confront something even more disturbing than the perpetrators themselves, the bystander effect.
Precisely. Their inaction, while horrifying, highlights the immense power of societal pressures.
Yeah.
We'll unpack this further later on. The fear, the diffusion of responsibility, all these factors that allow such horrors to happen right under everyone's noses.
It's like the foundation of a society crumbling when you realize that even a family unit can succumb to this kind of paralysis in the face of evil. And
Yeah.
as awful as this is, we're just at the beginning. What unfolds over the next 40 days is almost beyond comprehension.
It is, and while the specifics of the torture are difficult to hear, they're vital to understanding the depths of depravity involved and the sheer resilience of the human spirit.
We're not going to go into graphic detail, but
Yeah.
it's important to understand that this wasn't just one act repeated endlessly. It was a horrific,
Right.
ever-changing menu of abuse designed to inflict maximum pain and suffering. And as if that wasn't bad enough, this wasn't some hidden horror show. Others were invited to participate.
And that's the truly terrifying aspect. It wasn't just the warped morality of 4 boys. It was the horrifying reality of a community, a group of people who knew and did nothing.
Right.
Some even chose to join in. It throws the entire notion of social responsibility into question.
It makes you wonder how many others knew but were too scared to speak up. Where does that line blur between fear and complicity? It's a question that haunts this entire case.
It does. It speaks to a darkness that exists in all of us. The capacity for evil is unsettling, But the potential for inaction, for turning a blind eye, that's what truly keeps me up at night.
Me too. But even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, Junko never gave up. There was a daring, albeit unsuccessful, escape attempt.
Right.
And remember that desperate phone call to the police that got cut short?
Right.
It speaks volumes about her will to live.
It does, and it makes the outcome all the more tragic. As time went on, there are even indications that the perpetrator's interest in torturing her waned.
That's a detail I find incredibly unsettling.
Yeah.
It's like they were bored, as if 40 days of unimaginable cruelty had somehow lost its appeal.
Yeah.
What does that say about their mindset?
It hints at something even more disturbing than sadism, a chilling indifference, a dehumanization of Junko that allowed them to compartmentalize their actions.
Yeah.
We'll delve into the psychology of this later, but it's a chilling reminder of the dark potential of the human psyche.
Right.
Now, let's move to the end of those horrific 40 days and the aftermath of Junko's murder. This wasn't a crime of passion, a sudden escalation ending in a tragic mistake.
Right.
Junko's murder was premeditated,
Yeah.
almost casual in its brutality.
And the way they disposed of her body, it sends chills down my spine.
Right, the cement drum, more than just a gruesome detail, it speaks volumes about their attempt to erase not just the evidence of their crime,
Right.
but Junko herself, its dehumanization even in death.
Trying to pretend it never happened, but the truth has a way of coming out, and in this case it happened in a pretty roundabout way, didn't it?
It did. Miyano was eventually arrested, but not for Junko's murder initially.
Right.
It was for the gang rape of another young woman,
Oh, wow.
a crime committed after Junko's death.
It's like they were on some kind of horrific spree and the brutality just became normal.
Right.
Makes you wonder how many other victims there might have been, how many other stories went untold.
That's a question that continues to haunt this case.
Yeah.
But Miyano's arrest for this other crime is the thread that unravels everything.
Right.
Thinking the police are already onto him about Junko, he confesses and leads them to her body.
So, justice for Junko, right? Sadly, that's where this story takes another infuriating turn.
Yeah.
The sentences handed down to these four, well, justice doesn't seem to fit, does it?
The sentencing disparity in the Junko Furuta case remains one of its most controversial aspects. Miyano, considered the ringleader, received a 20-year sentence, but the others, Minato, 5 to 9 years, Watanabe, 5 to 7, and Agura, the youngest, was sentenced to a mere 8 years in a juvenile facility.
Let those numbers sink in for a moment. For taking a young girl's life, for 40 days of unimaginable cruelty, those were the consequences. It's no wonder this case sparked and continues to spark such outrage.
And it's crucial to remember these aren't just abstract numbers. The leniency shown to these perpetrators had real-world consequences.
Right.
Ogier, for example, was eventually released.
Yeah.
And what did he do? He assaulted another man, echoing the violence of his past. It makes you question if true rehabilitation is even possible in a system that seems to prioritize the perpetrator over the victim.
It's heartbreaking, and it throws the whole idea of justice into question. We've laid out this horrific story, but now comes the truly crucial part, the deep dive.
Right.
Because this isn't just about individual acts of evil, it's about a web of societal failures, legal loopholes, and cultural forces that allowed this to happen.
Right.
And perhaps even more disturbingly, might allow it to happen again.
You've hit the nail on the head. The Junko Furuta case isn't an isolated incident. It's a stark reflection of the dark undercurrents that exist even in societies that consider themselves safe and ordered.
So let's untangle this web, starting with one of the biggest elephants in the room. The Yakuza. We know Miyano had connections there, and many believe this influenced the lenient sentences. What are your thoughts on this?
It's impossible to ignore the shadow the Yakuza casts over this case. While concrete evidence of their direct involvement in a cover-up or influencing the sentencing is difficult to come by,
Right.
their presence is palpable.
It's like this unspoken pressure, this undercurrent of fear that might have impacted how the investigation and trial were handled.
Exactly. We have to remember that Japan at that time had a very different cultural understanding of organized crime.
Yeah.
There's a code of silence, a reluctance to cross these powerful entities.
Right.
So while we can't definitively say they dictated the outcome, it's a factor that simply can't be ignored.
Absolutely. And then there's the bystander effect, something that's as relevant today as it was back then. We talked about Minato's parents, their knowledge of what was happening under their own roof, but they weren't the only ones, were they?
Tragically, no. Several sources indicate that others were invited to the house, that they witnessed the accused, and some may have even participated Yet no one spoke up, no one went to the authorities.
It's almost incomprehensible to know a young girl is being held captive, tortured, and do nothing. It's like their own fear became a prison.
It's easy to judge, to say we'd act differently, but the bystander effect is a powerful psychological phenomenon.
Right.
We convince ourselves someone else will act, that it's not our responsibility,
Yeah.
or we're paralyzed by the potential consequences of speaking out.
It really makes you examine your own moral compass, doesn't it?
It does.
Would I have been brave enough to stand up in that situation? It's a question that stays with you.
It does, and it highlights a larger societal issue, the pressure to conform, to not rock the boat even when we know something is terribly wrong.
We've talked about the yakuza, the bystander effect, but we can't forget the role of the legal system itself.
Right.
Many argue that the sentences, or lack thereof, were a direct result of Japan's juvenile laws at the time.
That's a critical point. In 1988, Japan had different legal protections for minors, even those accused of heinous crimes.
Right.
The focus was on rehabilitation, on offering young offenders a second chance.
Which in theory is a noble goal, but in this case it resulted in what many perceive as a gross miscarriage of justice.
Precisely. It's important to note that the public outcry, the sheer outrage over the Junko Furuta case sentences, did lead to changes.
Okay.
Japan amended its juvenile laws, acknowledging that some acts demand harsher punishments regardless of age.
So in a way, as tragic as it was, Junko's case became a catalyst for reform.
It shows the power of public pressure, of demanding accountability, even when it's difficult, even when it's painful.
Yeah, it's a reminder that justice isn't a single verdict, but like an ongoing process, right?
Right.
It requires us to stay vigilant, to challenge the status quo, and to learn from tragedies like this.
Yeah.
But legal reforms are just one piece of the puzzle. There are deeper, more cultural forces at play here too, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. To truly understand the why behind this case, especially Miyano's motivations, we need to examine the role of toxic masculinity.
Okay, let's unpack that. We're talking about those societal expectations of what it means to be a man, right?
Right.
The pressure to be dominant, aggressive, even violent.
Exactly. Think back to what we know about Miyano. The gang affiliation, the need for control, the desire to exert power over others. These weren't just abstract personality traits. They were likely exacerbated by the culture he was immersed in.
So we're talking about a culture that often glorifies violence, especially among young men, equating it with strength and power. And this case becomes a terrifying example of how those warped ideals can manifest in extreme ways.
Precisely. Add in the influence of gang mentality, the whole us versus them dynamic, the constant need to prove oneself, and you have a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
In Junko, Miyano may have seen a challenge to his perceived authority, a threat to his masculinity, and reacted with unimaginable cruelty.
It's a stark reminder that these societal issues have very real, very dangerous consequences. We can't just dismiss them as like boys being boys. You know,
Right.
we need to challenge these harmful norms, encourage healthier expressions of masculinity, create a culture where violence is never the answer.
I couldn't agree more, and that brings us to the heart of this deep dive, wouldn't you say?
Right.
It's not enough to just dissect the past.
Right.
We need to learn from it,
Yeah.
apply these lessons to the present, and hopefully prevent such horrors from happening again.
You're right. So as we wrap up, it feels like we're left with more questions than answers, but maybe that's the point.
Yeah.
We'll never know what Junko Furuta could have become, the life she was robbed of. That, to me, is the truest tragedy.
It is, but her story, as difficult as it is to hear, can be a call to action for all of us.
Yeah.
To be more than bystanders.
Right.
To speak up against injustice, to challenge harmful social norms, and to fight for a world where such atrocities are never repeated.
It's a heavy burden, but a necessary one. Junko's story deserves to be more than just a cautionary tale. It needs to be a catalyst for change.
Well said. If even one person listening today is inspired to learn more, to get involved, to make a difference in their own community, then we've honored Junko's memory in a meaningful way.
I think the Junko Furuta case may be closed, but the conversation it started continues. And for me, that's a glimmer of hope in all this darkness. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.